important topic. The rule has been postponed for the time being, but actually there's some new developments as recent as today, which I'm sure our panelists will touch on as to how this is evolving. But we're thrilled to have you all here. So glad to have our panelists, and I'm really excited to have Andrew Brasher, our Solicitor General with the Alabama Attorney General's Office. He will be our moderator, and we will just welcome them to the stage as soon as they're ready. Thank you.
All right, everybody. So as Catherine said, my name is Andrew Brasher. I'm the Solicitor General of Alabama, and I appreciate Alabama Policy Institute asking me to moderate what I'm sure will be a very interesting and spirited debate. There are actually two interesting Alabama connections to the issue that is going to be discussed here today. The first is that the Wetumpka Tea Party is one of the Tea Party groups in the country that had its application for 501c4 status sort of super reviewed by the IRS during the scandal that took place where IRS agents were flagging applications for 501c4 status that had the words Tea Party in them. So that was the Wetumpka Tea Party was actually impacted by that. The other sort of interesting connection, Alabama connection to the issue today is that a businessman from Alabama named Sean McCutcheon actually recently filed a federal action to challenge parts of McCain-Feingold campaign contribution limits as unconstitutional, which ended up in a Supreme Court case that was resolved last term, holding certain parts of those contribution limits unconstitutional. And part of his rationale for bringing that action was that those limits discriminated against, basically in an unrational way, against large campaign contributors. So we have kind of two Alabama connections to this debate today. So let me start with that said. I'm going to introduce the two debaters, starting with Dr. Craig Holman from Public Citizen, who's sitting to my left. He has a PhD. He's the government affairs lobbyist for Public Citizen. He has previously served as a senior policy analyst at the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University Law School, School of Law. He has worked closely with reform organizations and Democratic Congressional Caucus in drafting and promoting something called the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act, which is the new federal lobbying and ethics reform legislation that was actually signed into law in 2007. As a consequence of working so closely with our congressional leaders on this legislation, he has also been asked to work with European non-governmental organizations and members of the European Commission and Parliament in developing a lobbyist registration system for the European Union. Sitting to my right is Hans Von Spakovsky. He is an authority on a wide range of issues. He also happens to be from Huntsville, Alabama. His expertise is very broad. It includes civil rights, civil justice, the First Amendment. He's the manager of the Heritage Foundation's Election Law Reform Initiative, and he studies and writes about campaign finance restrictions, about voter fraud, and voter ID. Before joining Heritage, Hans served 2 years as a member of the Federal Election Commission. He's also worked at the Justice Department in a number of capacities. So before the debaters start, let me also just say that these are going to be our debate rules. We're going to have an opening affirmative statement from Dr. Holman for about 12 minutes, then from Mr. Von Spakovsky for about 12 minutes in response to that, and then we'll go back and forth twice with 3 to 4 minute rebuttals by Dr. Holman and Mr. Von Spakovsky. So first, Dr. Holman.
Thank you very much, Solicitor General, and thank you for inviting me to address this group. The issue, and I want to clarify what the issue is, it's about electioneering activity by nonprofits and the IRS rulemaking trying to address this issue. It is a very hot topic in Washington, D.C., and I suspect it is here as well. As was mentioned earlier, just a couple hours ago, Senator Portman introduced a rider to a Senate appropriations bill that would prohibit the IRS from taking on this rulemaking. His rider is not alone. There have already been similar riders attached to the House appropriations bills prohibiting the IRS from proceeding with rulemaking on this issue, prohibiting the Securities and Exchange Commission from proceeding with rulemaking on whether or not to require disclosure of political spending by publicly owned corporations, and as well as a rider that is several riders that would prohibit President Obama from issuing an executive order that would mandate that federal contractors disclose their political spending. So this is a very hot topic, and a series of hearings are being held. Just on Thursday, there's going to be a hearing by the House Ways and Means Committee on whether or not the IRS was targeting its enforcement and auditing procedures. There's going to be a hearing the following Wednesday by the Senate Subcommittee on Oversight on nonprofit electioneering. I received a call from Senator Coons about 2 weeks ago, who is setting up the minority testimony before the Senate Subcommittee on Oversight on nonprofit electioneering. And he called to ask if I wanted to testify. You know, I said, yes, of course, I'd be delighted to testify. He said, okay, Greg, that sounds great. I said, no, I'm Craig. He said, you're not Greg? No. Are you Greg Colvin? No, I'm Craig Holman. Never mind. So Greg Colvin is going to be testifying next week, who, by the way, I work with on the Bright Lines project. I want to, with all this controversy going on the Hill, and I know I've got to keep it down to about 12 minutes, I want to explain a project that's been going on for about 6 years now. It's called the Bright Lines Project. It began long before the IRS scandal. And what it is a number of nonprofit organizations, particularly a coalition called Independent Sector and others, decided that the tax code, when it comes to defining political intervention, is so ambiguous, and the IRS has so much discretion in determining what is political activity by nonprofits, that all us nonprofits are, quite frankly, frightened as to what we can and cannot do, and very confused about it. In my own office, Public Citizen, I've got my litigation team forever trying to prevent me from doing news interviews if I talk about candidates, which I know I can do. But my litigation team is a little concerned, and so it shows the extent of the confusion. So 6 years ago, a number of nonprofit groups decided to employ some leading tax lawyers, Greg Colvin being one of them, Beth Kingsley and some others, to try to come up with what we call bright lines definitions. The whole purpose is to reduce the amount of discretion the IRS has in determining what is political intervention. We want to clearly define it in the statutes as well as in the rules, and so that we all know what we can do, and we can kind of push the IRS out of this whole thing. It's become somewhat of a different issue recently. But, well, first of all, just to backpedal a little bit, the IRS, we have consulted with the IRS and the Treasury Department on the Bright Lines project. They know full well what our recommendations are. And the IRS came out with one set of proposals for rulemaking last year that was unbelievable. I mean, it drew the hostility of just about everybody from the left and the right. It was a remarkable thing in the sense that it went so bright lines that it would have prohibited nonprofit groups from even discussing candidates on their websites, from issuing voter comparison catalogs like the League of Women Voters does. It had no safe harbors. I mean, this drew the ire of pretty much everyone. There were 160,000 public comments submitted to the IRS when they came out with this first new set of rules. And literally 67% said, IRS, you've got to do something to come up with some clear definitions, but not this, not this. And so finally the IRS did withdraw that, and they are in the process of coming out with a new set of rules, which we're expecting to hear about any month, even though they've made it clear that they're not going to actually decide upon the rulemaking until after the election to try to depoliticize it. Now, it's become very significant to a lot of groups because in the meantime, we've had some abuses both of the tax code and the elections code when it comes to transparency of money in politics. Prior to the Citizens United decision in 2010, there were a handful of nonprofit groups that I considered probably in violation of the tax code. Spending a lot of time on electioneering, not disclosing who their donors are. Americans for Job Security, I filed a complaint against them, for instance, with the IRS. The IRS never did anything on that or any of the other complaints prior to 2010. And then following the Citizens United decision, we just saw a tsunami of new money flowing into elections, much of it from nonprofit groups that do not have to disclose their donors. The IRS, because of Citizens United, was now under a lot of demands by groups that believe in transparency of where money is coming from to influence our vote to do something. Following the Citizens United decision, just to give you an idea how much new outside money started flowing into our elections. The decision was January 21, 2010. The immediate next election, in 2010, we saw a fourfold increase in outside spending. And that was when nonprofit groups and also corporations who were funneling money through nonprofit groups or others were dipping their toes in the water saying, can we really do this? We've never been allowed to do this before. And they've realized they could do it. They could go undisclosed, so anonymous behind the nonprofits. And so in 2012, we saw another fourfold increase. That's bad enough, seeing that kind of excessive money flowing into the elections. But what is truly, truly troubling, and what this IRS rulemaking is partly about, is what we call dark money. Because nonprofits generally are not required to disclose who their donors are, those nonprofits that want to get involved in electioneering and actually influence how we vote also don't have to disclose their donors. When this money is being used to influence elections and coming from secret donors, that's what we call dark money. And this is becoming a huge problem in our elections. And if we don't address it now, it's going to become ever more so monumental as secret money is going to be trying to influence our vote. You know, and I want to emphasize, this secret money is only secret to us. As a lobbyist, I'm a lobbyist for Public Citizen. The role of lobbyists on behalf of any nonprofit or corporation for that matter is to make sure those who can be influenced by knowing where this money is coming from know it. So the lobbyists will make sure that lawmakers understand, you know, that huge campaign budget supporting you in the last election, that came from us. That's the role of the lobbyists. Only the public is kept in the dark as to where this money comes from. And this poses a severe danger to the integrity of democracy. Transparency of money in our elections is a very fundamental pillar of democracy. Just to quote Justice Scalia in the Citizens United decision, where, by the way, the courts have repeatedly upheld transparency of money in politics almost every time it's come before them. And Scalia embodied this sentiment when he said, requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. Transparency of money in our elections is a critical pillar to our democratic workings. And if we don't address what's going on, in the nonprofit sector, where most of the Stark money is coming from, our democracy is in peril at that point. We're now entering the 2016 election, which is going to be the most expensive, messiest election we've seen in history. I'm expecting expenditures to well exceed $10 billion just for the federal elections, exceed $10 billion, and we have a Federal Election Commission that really, and an IRS so far, that really are not playing the role of the cop on the beat. So we have no one enforcing the laws that exist, no one enforcing the rules that govern nonprofits, no one enforcing the disclosure requirements. We are going into the most expensive, messiest election we've ever seen. This is something that the IRS can help address. Now, the IRS is not responsible for elections, but the IRS is responsible for the behavior of nonprofit organizations. Nonprofit organizations are supposed to be for the social welfare when we're talking about C4s. They should be pursuing a public, not a private interest, and they can do C4s, C5s, C6s, can do some activity in elections. But if it becomes a significant part of their activity, we need the IRS to start laying down exactly what is political activity that nonprofits can do, and for that matter, how much they can do. We need some bright lines. We need some clear standards. We need the IRS not to exercise their 11-point facts and circumstances subjective standard that has everyone from the Tea Party to public citizen quite alarmed. We need a bright line standard, and we need the IRS to proceed with this rulemaking.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the Alabama Policy Institute for inviting me down here. I know as soon as y'all heard the name Von Spakovsky, you figured I must be from Huntsville, right? Craig and I have had this debate before, and it probably should come as no surprise to you that I completely disagree with just about everything he's told you. Our democracy is not in peril. In fact, I think our democracy today is vibrant, and in fact, one of the reasons things are better today is because of the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court in 2010. The incumbency rate of members of Congress has gone down dramatically since that decision came out because it freed up independent political speech. In fact, the incumbency rate went down at a faster rate and at a greater rate than at any time since 1974, when we first put in all these new rules to restrict campaigning. Now, I certainly agree with Craig that this rule that the IRS put out was a horrible rule. And they basically, let me tell you what this rule was. This rule was an attempt by the IRS to, through regulation, implement what Lois Lerner was trying to do, which was to stamp out any kind of political speech and political activity by conservative nonprofits. Now, one thing you didn't get from Craig is kind of an explanation of the basics of this. And let me give that to you, okay? Look, if you contribute money directly to a federal candidate, that gets reported, okay? It gets reported to the FEC. Everyone can see how much money candidates get. Nonprofits cannot contribute directly to candidates, but so direct contributions by individuals and others, that's all reported. What we're talking about here is there's this move on, particularly by the progressive left, to force nonprofits to disclose who their donors are. Now, why do they want them to do that? Look, if you're a 501c3, you're a charity, right? You can't engage in any political activity. If you're a 501c4, and that's anybody from the NRA to NARAL to Americans United for Life, all those, the Sierra Club, you're a 501c4. You're also a tax-exempt organization. That's what all the Tea Party organizations were. And you can engage in some political activity as long as it's not the majority of what you do. Now, Public Citizen and others want to drive those nonprofits completely out of being able to do anything in the political arena because they say, well, the tax code says a 501c4, like the Sierra Club and others, has to be devoted to social welfare. And they say, well, politics has nothing to do with social welfare. Well, excuse me, please. I don't care what your organization is. I don't care what the issue is. You know, whether you're interested in guns because you're a member of the NRA, whether you're interested in the abortion issue, depending on whichever side you're on, our government today is so large and intrudes so far down into everything we do that if you're a member of an organization that shares your beliefs on a certain issue, if you want to affect that issue, you've got to be involved in politics because the government controls so much of what you do. Now, people are always talking about transparency, how we've got to have transparency. Well, we certainly have that with regard to contributions to candidates. But transparency is about us being able to keep an eye on what the government is doing, not the government keeping an eye on what we are doing. And while it sounds great, this idea that nonprofits should have to disclose their donors, what that means is this. Let me ask you a question. How many of you are members of an organization like the NRA or Americans United for Life or something like that, have given money to them? Okay. What they mean by transparency is that you will have to report to the government which of these organizations you're a member of and how much money you've given to them. That's the only way to be able to disclose this. Now, you know, there was a case out of Alabama in 1958, 59 on this very issue when the state government here went after the NAACP because they wanted their membership information and their donor information because they didn't like what the NAACP was doing. And in that case, you know, the court said effective advocacy of both public and private points of view, particularly controversial ones, is undeniably enhanced by group association. You know, if you're somebody like me, I don't have a lot of money like Michael Bloomberg, so I can't take $10 million and go out and try to get gun control put in. But if I'm a believer in the Second Amendment, I join a membership organization like the NRA. That's how I multiply my voice and get something done. And that's something the Supreme Court recognized. They also said, it's beyond debate that freedom to engage in association for the advancement of beliefs and ideas is an inseparable aspect of the liberty assumed by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which embraces freedom of speech. Compelled disclosure of membership in an organization engaged in advocacy of particular beliefs, there is no question that that will chill speech and chill advocacy. And for anybody who has any doubts about that, all you have to do is look at what happened in Wisconsin recently, when, I don't know how many of you all have read about this, a very big case, a Democratic local prosecutor in Wisconsin got angry over the fact that his wife, who's in a teachers union, was upset over the union bills that the governor pushed through the Wisconsin legislature. So using this horrible law they have, he opened up this huge investigation, a secret investigation called a John Doe investigation of virtually every conservative nonprofit organization in Wisconsin. Why? Because he claimed they were violating the law by coordinating their political speech on issues. Now, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin shut that investigation down about a week ago, finally. But you know what happened in that investigation? They had paramilitary type police forces show up in the middle of the night to execute search warrants at the homes of members of nonprofit groups like the Alabama Policy Institute. Scared the bejesus out of these people, seized all their records, and all of this was because this DA and others didn't like the independent political speech that these people were engaging in. Now, what happened to these organizations? Not only did they have the huge cost of fighting this case, but their donors dried up. And why is that? Because all of you know that, look, I get paid to spout my opinion. You know, I could tell you exactly what I think about things. But there are many ordinary people in this country who cannot afford to have their neighbors know which organizations they're members of or give money to because it may cause them problems. That's exactly what happened in California. In California, you'll recall voters there passed a ballot referendum, Proposition 8, which was on the gay marriage issue. Well, some gay organizations out there who didn't like that ballot referendum took the information that they got from the state of California. In the state of California, if you contribute to a ballot referendum, more than, I think it's $100, you have to disclose your name and address. They put that information up on websites. They attached Google Map functions to it so that people could go to the homes of these people. And individuals who had contributed to that lost their jobs, had their businesses boycotted, and had damage at their houses and their cars, all of which is a vivid evidence of the kind of harassment, intimidation, and other things that happen when you force disclosure of donors. Now, every time I hear this term dark money, I almost want to laugh because it reminds me of that term from The Wizard of Oz, lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my. Dark money is this term that the left has come up with through a focus group because it raises these just terrible connotations with people. Dark money is simply the money that you contribute to an organization whose views you support, like the NRA or the Sierra Club or something like that. Now, you heard this claim that, oh my God, this dark money has been flooding our election and just making things terrible. That is simply not the case at all. In 2012, so that's the presidential election, right? The total money spent on our elections in this country, this is everything. Candidates, political committees, PACs, and nonprofits who did some independent political spending was about $7.3 billion. Now, all these folks in Washington will tell you, oh, that's just terrible. That's just way too much money to spend on elections. Well, excuse me, but $7.3 billion, in 2014, we spent $7.4 billion on Halloween. That $7.3 billion is only about 3% of the total amount of money that U.S. companies spent on advertising their products and services last year. I actually don't think that's a lot of money when you consider that, what is that $7.3 billion used for? It's for candidates to advertise to voters who they are, what they think, how they intend to solve our problems, and we use that information to choose who's going to represent us. To me, that's not a lot of money to be spending to pick everyone who's going to be in Congress and the president, the people who's going to lead the country. But here's the other thing. Out of that $7.3 billion 2012 election, how much was spent by nonprofits engaging in these independent political expenditures? Only about 4% of that. And every single penny of that money was reported to the Federal Election Commission where I used to work. So if the SEIU union ran a political ad saying, you know, you really shouldn't vote for this particular candidate for Congress because they're bad on union matters. That was all disclosed. The SEU had to file a report with the FEC saying they had spent this money, and you certainly knew that it was the SEIU running that particular ad because they're required to say at the end of the ad, paid for by the SEIU. Now,
Okay, Hans.
sorry, is that it?
Yeah, let's give
Okay.
Greg an opportunity to respond.
All right, I will just end by saying, today we have more competition, more freedom, and I think that's a good thing.
Thanks, Hans. Always a pleasure to disagree with you. I do not see our democracy as becoming increasingly vibrant. I see it as becoming increasingly troubled. We are now facing elections in which primary contests may drag on longer, but it's not because voters or the American public or constituents want to see that happen. It's because there happen to be one or two or a dozen millionaires or billionaires who can keep on funding the races of candidates who really don't have any of our supports. We're seeing longer contested races, probably ending with the same results, but perhaps undermining the credibility of the politicians and the candidates, and in the end, those who finally get elected to office. This is not healthy. When we take a look at the super PAC spending, not nonprofits, but super PAC, because here we know who the contributors were. In the 2012 and 2014 elections, literally a majority of their funds came from 100 individuals. They're the ones financing our election. That's not what I would call democracy. It's not what I was taught is democracy back in elementary school. I want to emphasize that no one is talking about disclosure of associations or the groups that we belong to. The IRS isn't talking about this. I'm not talking about this. What we're talking about is disclosure of the money that is spent to influence our vote, our elections. If a group, a nonprofit group, wants to get involved in our elections, perfectly fine, but tell us where their money's coming from. If the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts want to do their job, perfectly fine. We have no business knowing where they're getting their money from, as long as they don't tell us who to vote for. So we're just talking about nonprofits who get involved in elections. That's what we're looking at. And by the way, it's a lot of money. I mean, if you want to take a look at percentages or overall budgets, I once used to work for a political scientist named Herb Alexander, who would relish at the point of saying we spend more selling soap than we do electing our office holders. Well, if you want to equate our elections with selling soap, I mean, that's one thing. But that is not what elections are about. We're not supposed to be marketing products here. We are supposed to be having sincere, honest, open, transparent dialogue between the values that this country is going to represent in government. That requires transparency. That's why even the Roberts Court steadfastly, repeatedly has upheld the value of transparency when it comes to our elections, including having nonprofit groups that want to get involved in our elections tell us where their money's coming from. Remember, we're not talking about transparency just being about knowing what the government's doing. We are talking about us wanting to know who is paying for that message on television, telling us who is the better candidate and who isn't. The transparency is for us.
Should I go up there? Well, Craig brings up this bugaboo of super PACs, like they're some great evil. We had super PACs way before 1974 when we put in all these new campaign restrictions. What's a super PAC? A super PAC is simply a group of people who get together and say, we want to pool our money to support or oppose a candidate. They don't make direct contributions to candidates. okay? Any direct contributions they make individually, that's going to have to get reported. And the thing about a super PAC is, look, if 5 people get together and say, all right, we're each going to put in $10,000, so we'll have $50,000 to buy an ad, perhaps, that says support a particular candidate, all of that gets reported to the FEC. All the contributions to that super PAC get reported to the FEC. What is being talked about in various places around the country, and I counted it up, there's been proposed legislation in 12 states to make nonprofit associations disclose their donors. There's ballot measures in 2 states that want to do that. And I can tell you there is only one reason for this. And all you have to do is look at the history of the last 10 years about this. Look, there have been many successful campaigns to harass and intimidate individuals for the donations they have made. If you want the best example of that, look at how the CEO of Mozilla, Brendan Eich, was driven out of the company he helped found. Why? Because he had given a $1,000 contribution to the Proposition 8 campaign in California. I could tell you, I've been in Washington, I'm an Alabama native, I've been in Washington now for 15 years. And I'm telling you that people there want disclosure of nonprofit donors because they want to be able to harass and intimidate individuals so they will not contribute to those organizations, and those organizations' resources will dry up. That is the only reason for that. If the NRA runs a political ad that tells you that you shouldn't vote for a particular candidate because that candidate's got a bad view about the Second Amendment and guns, the folks who want to force disclosure of the NRA's donors think that you're too stupid to figure out the credibility and bias of the NRA's ad based on the fact that it's the NRA. How is it going to somehow help you to make your decision about the credibility of that ad if, in addition to knowing it's the National Rifle Association that has put this ad together, how much is it going to help you if you suddenly are also told who the NRA's donors are? Is that somehow going to change your opinion? If it's Planned Parenthood, I don't particularly like Planned Parenthood, but I think if they want to be able to run a political ad about an abortion issue, they should be able to do it. Is it really going to change my opinion about an ad they run if I happen to know who their biggest donors are? I don't think so. And the marginal increase you get with that transparency does not balance out the huge invasion of privacy and First Amendment rights of those individuals.
So what's your response to that?
You know, when it comes to the NRA or the Sierra Club spending money on elections, we generally know where their money is coming from for the most part. It'll be usually fairly small donations for the NRA, people who relish their gun rights. For the Sierra Club, people who relish the environment, and worry about climate change. These are going to be small donors. This is not my real concern. I mean, if it was just the NRA and the Sierra Club doing all this dark money spending, this wouldn't really be much of an issue. It becomes an issue when it's groups that we don't know who they are. We don't know that perhaps they are funded by one single donor, perhaps a corporation, a tobacco company who rails against some candidates because they haven't invested heavily in cancer research. For us to judge the merits of those campaign messages, it is exceedingly useful to know who is behind that message. That's the dark money that we're worried about. That's the dark money that the Roberts Court says should be disclosed to the public when it comes to our elections, so we have a good idea what's going on. We're not talking about groups that we know about. By the way, I want to point out, pulling back to nonprofits, sir, it's getting so bad with the IRS not actually enforcing the tax code when it comes to the permissible political intervention by nonprofits, that even C3s are now spending their money to get involved in elections. There was recently a series of ads run by the League of Conservation Voters Foundation, a 501c3 that the Republican Party has filed a complaint against. Quite frankly, the League of Conservation Voters is probably betting correctly that the IRS isn't going to do anything to them. So they can just pump money into elections, and it doesn't matter because there is no cop on the beat.
Let's give, Hans, would you like to respond to the notion that the IRS is not enforcing the current laws?
I doubt that all of the Tea Party organizations and others who have had tremendous problems would agree to that. But I'd say, let's go to the audience question.
Yeah, let's, so if anybody has any questions, I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask just to kind of clarify a few things. The first is to Hans. So part of Craig's presentation was that currently this is a standardless exercise for the IRS in deciding whether a 501c4 is complying with the law. And that this rule that is currently being proposed is at least better than the status quo. And do you agree with that notion, or do you disagree with that?
No, I disagree. Look, in essence, what the IRS does now is they take a look at a nonprofit organization, a 501c4, and they look at all of its activities and its spending, and they try to determine whether the political activity that it might have engaged in, the election speech, were the resources dedicated to that a majority of what it did. If it spent 10% of its funding on it, then they're okay. If they spent 51% of its funding on it, it's okay. Now, yeah, that's kind of a general test, and it does give a certain amount of leeway. But this new rule by the IRS, in essence, banned all kinds of activity by nonprofits that they considered to be quote-unquote candidate-related political activity that would have basically made it impossible for nonprofits to do basic things like put out something that every nonprofit does who's interested in an issue, which is all of them put out voter guides telling people how candidates are on their particular issue. Doing that would have gotten them in big trouble, and it's like, why would we want to stop that kind of education of voters because we somehow think that's a bad thing? I think that's a good thing.
On C4s, could you explain that a little bit about what Citizens United held and how that relates to 501c4s?
Oh, yes, I apologize. I should have explained that. The Citizens United decision, in a nutshell, was that corporations shall be treated as persons under the First Amendment, and therefore corporations are allowed to make unlimited expenditures, independent expenditures or electioneering communications for or against candidates. The court did not address whether corporations could make contributions to candidates. So what's happened is that what we suspect has happened, and quite frankly, it's very difficult to prove one way or the other, is that we didn't see a very dramatic uptick in corporate spending contributions to groups like super PACs that disclose their donors, but we saw a huge fourfold increase in nonprofit spending. And we don't know where that money came from. I mean, my speculation is that much, if not most of it, came from corporations, because if a corporation were to pay directly, as Hans mentioned, if they were paid directly for a campaign ad on our TV, it would have to say paid for by Boeing Corporation. If they launder the money through Americans for Job Security or the Committee for Good Government or something like that, all you're going to see is paid for by Americans for Job Security. You're not going to know where that money came from and who's behind it.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up question with respect to that, and then we'll go to audience questions in a little bit. But, what is the government's interest in making it so that we all know who is supporting this speech? And to go back to the NAACP v. Alabama example, where the state of Alabama attempted to find out who was supporting the NAACP for a bad reason, to harass those people, why do we have any business knowing who is running these ads?
Let's define the government as us. We have a right to know who's trying to influence our vote. We're not talking about just some administrative agency or President Obama just being notified as to where the money is coming from. We're talking about a transparency disclosure system designed to educate us as to where the money is coming from. So that's who I would call the government. You know, when you talk about the NAACP case, I mean, that did not involve electioneering. That was a nonprofit group doing other lobbying activity, or something in which we're not even talking about in this debate. We're talking about those groups that want to run ads to tell us who to vote for. That's who we're talking about when we're talking about dark money.
Well, and Hans, do you disagree with the notion that the government has any interest at all, or that we have any interest at all in knowing who is?
The government has no business whatsoever knowing what organizations I'm a member of and give money to. I have a First Amendment right to privacy. I have a First Amendment right to association, which the court has upheld, and the government has no right to that information.
And because
period.
Craig mentioned electioneering activity, can you explain? I assume that you would, just based on your earlier talk, that you would agree that there should be disclosure for candidate contributions. Is there a difference between disclosure for candidate contributions?
Yes, and the difference is this. The whole reason we justify disclosure of contributions to candidates is because what happens to candidates? Well, if they get elected, they end up in office, and you want to see whether if that legislator, for example, then pushes through some bill in the state legislature or in Congress, was it the contributions that person, that candidate directly got that influenced them to do that? There is no such connection if I get together with 5 of my friends and we say, look, let's pool our money and buy an ad in the New York Times that says, President Obama's really been a bad president, and we shouldn't re-elect him in 2012. Because I'm not giving directly to him, I'm not giving directly, there's no influence other than the influence of the political speech that I'm engaging in. And I just don't see that the government or anybody else has any business in my having to disclose that.
Questions, Mr. Ayers?
Yeah, I just had a two-part question for Dr. Holman. I guess the first is, I'm hearing this overarching concern about transparency, and so that's why we need, for example, the IRS to do something. I wonder just what level of confidence people would have in the IRS really ensuring anything about transparency when it seems that the IRS itself and other federal organizations have serious transparency issues themselves. I mean, the head of the IRS taking, I think, somewhat incorrectly pleading fifth about things, and so that there seems to be a bit of a lack of connection there about if the concern is really transparency. And I guess the second part is, you had mentioned, I think at one point, we're really not talking about groups like the NRA or the Sierra Club, because we know about those groups. Well, the reality is you don't really know who's them, and that's kind of the point, is that you can assume that most of them are small donors and so forth, but there's plenty that you don't know about those groups. But I'm wondering how workable that test is if we say, I'm not really concerned about the groups that we generally know about, but other groups. That seems to be a very arbitrary kind of gut level. I mean, that somebody somewhere is making a choice about which groups they have a gut feeling for and which groups they don't. So maybe you could address that.
Sure, I'd like to address the second part of your question first, because that's easier for me. When I said I'm not particularly concerned about the Sierra Club or the NRA, because, we essentially know where that money's come from. It's not coming from some secret special interest or foreign corporation or other corporation. We sort of know where it's coming from. That doesn't mean they'd be excluded out of the disclosure regime. That's just my level of comfort. If they were the only ones abusing the nonprofit tax code, I would complain, but I wouldn't consider it such a dire threat to our democracy. However, they would not be excluded from disclosure. They would have to disclose, however the disclosure system set up, contributors of in excess of 200 or whatever it may be. So I didn't mean to exclude them. Just I felt more comfortable with them. You know, sort of a funny little anecdotal story about this that drew a lot of flack against me in particular on Capitol Hill was we were negotiating with Representative Van Hollen the Disclose Act. And the Disclose Act would set up a system, and this is the type of disclosure that I support, that where a group would set up a political account, and if they only make campaign expenditures out of that political account, they only have to disclose who contributes to that political account, not the rest of the organizations. Well, the NRA and the Sierra Club, the two largest nonprofit organizations, were steadfastly opposed to this, and they continue to be opposed to it, sort of. So Van Hollen worked out a deal with them. He said, okay, since we know who the NRA and Sierra Club is, we'll just write into the law that they're excluded from the disclosure system because that doesn't concern us. Boy, did that run into some flack on Capitol Hill. So we're not going to try that again. They'll be covered in anything. And by the way, Van Hollen had to rewrite that version of the Disclose Act because the Sierra Club exaggerated their number of members on their webpage. And so the law said any group in excess of, I don't know, 1.3 million, paying dues members doesn't have to disclose. Sierra Club said they were in excess of 1.3 million. Turns out they weren't. So the whole proposal had to be recalled and redrafted. But to get more to the more difficult point, my confidence in the IRS doing this well, I want to emphasize, because this was brought up earlier, the new IRS proposal is the old IRS proposal. We don't know what the new one is going to be yet. They haven't come out with their new recommendation. The old one was horrible for many of the same reasons that Hans has already brought up. And groups from the left and the right opposed that one. And we forced the IRS into pulling it and rewriting it. They're in the process of rewriting now. If they're going to come out with something good, I honestly don't know yet. However, what I do know is we've got to get something better than this 11-point facts and circumstances standard. We can't let the IRS have all this discretion in determining whether or not we've done legitimate political activity. We need to know what is permissible and what isn't. We need to have clear, bright line definitions. I've got a feeling, because Koskinen is now taking over this process, that the next set of recommendations from the IRS is going to be pretty good, hopefully along the lines of the Bright Lines Project, but I'm speculating. I really don't know.
Let me ask Hans to address one issue that came up with respect to that. As between the agencies of the federal government that could be involved in this problem, we have the IRS, which is someone controlled by someone who reports ultimately to the president, and then we have the Federal Election Commission, which is separately appointed commissioners in sort of a bipartisan basis. Is there any reason that the IRS should be involved in this instead of just doing whatever the FEC says or doesn't say?
No, in fact, the IRS shouldn't be involved in this at all. And I always find it kind of amusing that folks talk about, this horrible political activity by tax-exempt organizations like 501c4s. Look, the IRS used to do absolutely nothing about this until the late 1950s. And the whole reason they got into doing this was because of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Johnson got upset because there were ministers in churches speaking up against him and his candidacy. And so he pushed through a piece of legislation through Congress that got the IRS into this business. okay? And they're not very good at it. The last set of rules they tried to push through were so incompetently written, I was just amazed. And the FEC is the proper agency to handle this. Craig doesn't like the FEC. He thinks they don't do enough. I think they do more than they need to. And just one final word, you know, people keep saying disclosure is just so needed and we all have to have it. Let me ask just two quick questions. How many of you voted in the last election? Okay, how many of you went to the website of the FEC, where I used to be a commissioner, to check on who had given money to the candidates you were considering voting for before you made your decision on who you were going to vote for? Now be honest, how many people did that? Not a single person in this room was interested. That's how unimportant this disclosure of contributions is to the average voter.
Why don't you take a minute to address the average voter issue? Since you're apparently not average. I don't know whether you're above average or below average, but you're clearly not average.
Just one follow-up point I'd like to make. I mean, I find the history of LBJ and churches quite interesting. However, what I do know is that the IRS came up with one of its first actual disclosure systems for Section 527 political organizations following the 2000 elections. And this shows what happens if you don't know the sources of the funds. There was a group that nobody ever heard of called Republicans for Clean Air that launched a massive campaign on behalf of George Bush, who was running against John McCain in the Republican primary back in 2000. And, you know, everyone was trying to figure out, who are these folks? And do they really care about clean air? And their ads for George Bush were just touting his environmental record, you know, when he was governor of Texas. And, you know, we thought, okay, maybe this is the Sierra Club trying to disguise themselves as Republicans. It turns out to have been two billionaire friends of George Bush. I believe their names was the Wiley brothers. But no one knew that when it counted. It was only afterwards that they started bragging about how they could just pull out their wallet and have affected the entire Republican primary election. Following that, I worked with Senator McCain and others, and Brady and Lieberman, in drafting the Section 527 disclosure law. So at least we do have disclosure of those groups.
Any questions? Yes, Craig?
Couple points, I guess I'll start first with Craig. I mean, your whole premise seems to be that these ads are overwhelmingly effective and that we're all dupes, that if we see an ad by some group, we're going to believe it, and therefore that will affect our vote, whether we know who is behind it or not. You know? I think that's a fallacy of the logic. I mean, there are so many campaign ads out there without everyone saying whatever it is. People are sophisticated enough to know that whether it's a campaign ad from the candidate themselves or a third-party interest group or even the party itself, they're going to give a different value weights to it. But like you said, it is clean air, people for clean air for George Bush. Fine, you can see this ad come out, but like you said, you thought it was Sierra Club. Could be anybody. You know, if you want to be an uninformed voter, fine, you'll believe that, same as you'll believe that Obama's going to pay a mortgage. You know, it is, you're taking a huge jump Obama 2012 campaign shut those features off so that they could say, we don't have that information. And there was no enforceability about it. Now, on the flip side, when you're saying about transparency, well, it kind of was just overwhelmingly shocking that Obama said, joked about auditing his critics when he campaigned, and then the number of Republicans and conservative groups that did get audited right after he was elected seemed to spike dramatically.
Craig, is there a question in there somewhere?
I guess sort of is if the regulations, same thing gun control, if the regulations you have now aren't being enforced, why would any more regulation make a difference?
First of all, I'm not going to defend the Obama administration in this decision. I am a firm believer that we should not have foreign money influencing our elections or in any way financing our elections. And I am very concerned and very worried that we are now getting more and more foreign money flowing into our elections, largely because of the Citizens United decision. You cite an Obama decision that seemed to facilitate foreign money. I'm no defender of that. I want to shut that off. We don't need foreign governments and foreign nationals trying to tell us who's going to be in our Congress or our president. So anything we can do to curtail that is noble. By the way, there's another big opening for foreign money flowing into our elections because of a recent FEC deadlock, once again, in which there was a ballot measure in California that would have required porn movie makers to mandate that condoms had to be worn in the course of filming these porn movies. Well, a porn czar in Brussels, I believe, financed the No campaign. Literally a foreign interest financing this campaign. And when a complaint was filed with the FEC about letting foreign money influence our elections, the FEC deadlocked, which means foreign money can flow into our ballot measure campaigns openly at this point. Your first question about I view Americans as dupes, I do not. I really do believe in democracy, and I believe much more in the capacity of the average American than I do trust the plutocrats. So I want Americans to be as informed as possible when elections come up. I don't think we all sucker for just all campaign ads, but quite frankly, most of us don't have the time to go on the FEC webpage and take a look at where the money's coming from. So we need that type of transparency so that it gets filtered to us through the media, through friends talking about, well, you know who paid for that ad. Those are the type of interactions. Most of us just don't have time to sit there and follow politics like us policy wonks do. And so we need transparency to make the information behind these elections as available as possible to all Americans.
Do you have anything to say on the intelligence of the American electorate or foreign donors?
I think I have a lot more faith in the American electorate than a lot of campaign reform groups in Washington. I will say, you all should know, it's a violation of federal law. It's a violation of federal regulations for foreign corporations, foreign governments, foreign individuals to participate in American elections. The violations that Craig was talking about, those are potential criminal violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act. The responsibility for investigating that primary, because it's a potential criminal violation, was the Public Integrity Section of the Criminal Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. And for some reason, I'm not sure why, Eric Holder didn't open an investigation of that.
Questions? Robichaud.
With respect to the transparency issue alone, if you ignore the kind of viewpoint that some have that money is inherently bad in politics, would we be better served if we maintained the current FEC reporting program for candidates, but eliminated the limits on contributions to candidates and opened up contributions to corporations to candidates? Eliminate the ban directly from corporations to candidates and well as raising or eliminating the cap on contribution to candidates? Would that be better served in transparency?
Let me add something to that question, because I think that's a really good question. Is part of the flow of money into these non-for-profits just the fact that money is going to find a way to get into politics one way or the other? And if you have campaign contribution limits, if you have limits on giving money directly to candidates or to political parties, for example, is this just necessarily a byproduct of having those limits? And maybe it's better just to raise the limits or eliminate the limits.
So can I start with that?
You can start with that. That was a softball.
Well, no, the answer to that is, yes, look, the campaign finance rules that got put in place in the early 1970s, we've now been living under for 3 decades, I mean, they're one of the reasons so much money has moved into these independent groups. Because part of the rules that they put in place, including even newer restrictions that the McCain-Feingold law put in place in 2002, was they put in these huge restrictions on the political parties being able to spend money on their candidates. Now, what are political parties for? To spend money on their candidates. Well, when they put in all these restrictions on the political parties, that money moved into the independent sphere and made things worse. Because think of it this way, look, if a political party, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans, if they run a really atrocious ad, one that everybody thinks, that is a really nasty ad, they shouldn't be doing it. Well, guess what? Those political parties are permanent structures. So if people go to them and start complaining about this, they might actually do something about it and pull the ad. But if somebody sets up a fly-by-night independent organization that's just there for one election, what do they care if people complain about the atrociousness of their ads? So you actually had better responsibility, people taking more authority over what they do with the prior system. I actually think the restrictions are bad. And there are many states that allow corporate contributions. There are many states that don't have limits on contributions. And no one has shown that those state governments are somehow greater, more corrupt than the federal government. In fact, in many cases, it's the opposite.
The Citizens United decision and its progeny has created much of the problem that I'm talking about here. And that is not a justification for getting rid of what we have left when it comes to reasonable limits on money in politics. Super PACs did not really exist prior to Citizens United. What made them super PACs is subsequent decisions using the same rationale as Citizens United decided that the $5,000 contribution limit we had established for these independent expenditure committees is invalid. So they turned it from PACs into super PACs because now they could accept unlimited contributions. That poses several problems, but the main one that I've been dwelling upon is it means that a single corporation or a single very wealthy individual or special interest can put up a lot of money to unduly influence our election choices if we don't have transparency of that money. But that's no justification for eliminating the contribution limits to candidates or to party committees, because then you're going to have the same wealthy special interest just handing over that $250,000 directly to a lawmaker, and we know the problem that comes with that. I mean, that would just create a whole system not only of dark money but outright bribery. So I certainly would not support going there.
Yes, sir.
I have a one-sentence follow-up to Mr. Heimowitz's question and a two-sentence question prompted by Dr. Holman's mention of what he learned in grammar school. The follow-up was, how can I find out under the present system, and how does the present system prevent Rosneft and Lukoil from funding environmental groups that hate fracking, for example? And the two-sentence one for Dr. Holman was, when I was in grammar school, I learned that George Washington financed his campaign by handing out liquor to his voters. Richard Nixon financed his first campaign with money he won on poker games and troop transports, and Eisenhower and George McGovern were both thrust into national office by a cabal of secret people giving them large amounts of money. Same thing for the failed campaign of General MacArthur. Is the new system better?
Well, I'll say the new system isn't better because the first thing that happened, I think I've talked about this, look, once the new rules went in, the contribution limits, the incumbency retention rate skyrocketed. Because when you put in contribution limits, who does it hurt? It hurts challengers. Challengers don't have name recognition. You know, they don't have seats on congressional committees. It's much tougher for them to raise money. And so contribution limits help incumbents, they hurt challengers. One of the people who challenged these new restrictions back in the mid-'70s was Eugene McCarthy, not exactly conservative, right? Big liberal Democrat, almost knocked over Lyndon B. Johnson in the '68 presidential election. Eugene McCarthy was very much against these limits because he said if those limits had been in place in 1968, he would not have been able to mount a challenge to the sitting incumbent Democratic president. Because the way he got his campaign kick-started was he had a small group of friends who believed in him, thought he could do a good job, and they each gave him a lot of money as a core to get his campaign organized and going. And that's a supreme example of how these contribution limits hurt challengers.
Today's system is broken because of the Citizens United decision, so I don't mean to suggest that we have an ideal model here. As a matter of fact, if we don't reverse Citizens United, I really see the money overwhelming our democratic process in the end, and I believe our democracy is in dire risk because of that. However, I want to point out that throughout recent history, at least over the last century, we have improved over the era of the robber barons with a series of constructive ways of regulating money in politics and ensuring transparency of that money in politics, from banning corporate money in the Anti-Corruption Acts, the Hatch Act, banning government officials from being able to force campaign contributions from employees. The Federal Election Campaign Act finally set up a public financing system for the presidential elections, reasonable contribution limits, and a massive, very good disclosure system to BICRA in 2002, which tried addressing other problems. BICRA, for instance, had a disclosure regime set up identical to the Disclose Act that I just discussed earlier. And we went from literally in 2004 and 2006, after passing BICRA, to 100% donor disclosure. We knew where all the money was coming from on independent expenditures and electioneering communications. Then we started losing disclosure shortly before the Citizens United decision, compounded by the Citizens United decision. So, I mean, this is a process that requires vigilance to try to create a good, reasonable system of regulating and transparency of money in politics. But just because we haven't got it now is no reason to give up and say, okay, just throw all the laws out and let the plutocrats take over.
Questions? Matteo?
I have a question for Mr. Von Spakovsky. So earlier, Dr. Holman responded to Andrew's question saying that the compelling government interest here is educating the electorate. Now, assuming for a second the legitimacy of that interest, do you think that disclosure of independent donors is the least restrictive means of achieving that interest? If not, what might be a more narrowly tailored way to achieve it?
No, look, there's study after study that shows that the more that is spent in elections, the greater the knowledge of voters about the issues of the candidates, and frankly, the greater the turnout. So anything you do that is going to restrict spending, such as forcing donor disclosure on nonprofits, is actually going to hurt that. And I would point out, it's a little bit off the question, but since Citizens United keeps getting mentioned as this really evil decision by the Supreme Court, I'd ask you to keep two things in mind. The Citizens United decision was rendered in January of 2010. What happened in November of 2010? Do you all remember? We had the most competitive congressional elections since the 1930s. And if you think that's just a coincidence, that is just not the case. We again had very competitive congressional elections in 2014. That is because the ability to engage in independent political speech was unleashed by the Citizens United decision. That was good for a democracy because it leads to more competition. And on the individual and money thing, there's been study after study done, one just recently by a University of Massachusetts professor, that actually took a look at millionaires who could spend as much money as they wanted to on their own election, and the idea that the person with the most money wins, that study showed that 3/4 of those millionaires lost, despite way outspending their challengers. Money does not buy you victory in election campaigns. It can help get your message out, but if voters don't like your message, it doesn't matter how much money you spend, you're not going to win.
Let me ask Dr. Holman to respond to this point, I think, which is that is a world where less money is spent on politics better than a world where more money is spent on politics? I mean, is there a reason why we should prefer our political races to be less expensive?
Remember, I come at this from a political science perspective, so it isn't big money in more money in politics that I object to. It's how it's used. If it comes in very large chunks from special individuals or corporations, then it is very potentially corrupting. If it's not subject to disclosure, it can be very misleading. So when it comes to the amount of money in politics, I'm not coming up with a magic number. What I want to see is make sure that we don't allow any particular person to make such a large contribution or a significant contribution that they can buy favors. That's what we need to regulate. By the way, I want to add another political science perspective on this. You know, political scientists are very familiar that when it comes to money in politics, it's like a bell curve. I mean, the initial money that comes in helps you generate more votes and support, and it eventually peaks, and it becomes so redundant afterwards that it starts dropping off in its value. It just doesn't seem to produce that kind of value anymore. The problem is there isn't a single candidate or party official who believes this. They actually believe that the more money they raise, the better chances they have. And so for them, it's a full steam ahead war mentality of raising as much money as possible. And if we don't put reasonable limits on that, they're going to take money and perhaps feel a debt or obligation to the sources from which they got that money.
Well, we're almost done. I'm going to let each of our debaters give 1 or 2 minute talk if they'd like, starting with Hans.
Let me tell you how far the government and pro-reform groups have gone in this, in the idea of how much they are willing to restrict your ability to speak. And I can just give you 2 quick examples which should really scare the heck out of you. Okay? I was actually at the oral arguments in the Citizens United decision. And at one point in discussing one of the provisions that the Supreme Court threw out, this is one called the electioneering communications provision, which banned any ad that named a federal candidate within a certain period of time close to a general election or a primary on radio, TV, or satellite. And the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, said, well, you know, the government's in here saying this is constitutional. If Congress came in and amended this particular provision, which applied to TV and radio ads, banning them, and amended it so it would also put a ban on books and pamphlets, would that be constitutional? The Assistant Solicitor General of the United States, Malcolm Stewart, said yes, it would. So the United States government was saying that it would be okay for the government to ban books in the interest of campaign restrictions, which I just find absolutely shocking that that would be something to consider. And remember, last fall, every single Democrat in the United States Senate voted in favor of a resolution that would have amended the First Amendment to give Congress complete control to say and do whatever it wanted as long as it was anything having to do with influencing an election. First time, I think, in our history that we got a vote to pull back on the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Again, shocking and scary.
Dr. Holman, you get the last word.
That Senate vote was one of my biggest victories in recent years. we got every single Democratic senator to vote for a constitutional amendment to reverse Citizens United. And the constitutional amendment was worded in a compromise effort, I may add, because there were literally a dozen constitutional amendments being offered, all competing. So we sat all the leaders of the constitutional amendment campaigns together, got them to compromise, and the version they came up with is not necessarily saying corporations can't spend in elections or necessarily saying there will be limits, but just saying that Congress has the authority to set reasonable limits on money in politics and determine whether or not artificial entities can contribute. That was a big victory. Boy, we worked hard to get that. But I want to return really quickly to the nonprofits, since that's what we're really talking about here. With an anecdotal story. It was explained that in 2007 I helped pass the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act that helped level the playing field between moneyed lobbyists, K Street lobbyists, and lobbyists like me who has no money whatsoever. And, you know, I can't afford to do whining and dining or fly people to Scotland to play golf. And so we banned those types of expenditures by lobbyists, and that helped level the playing field somewhat. Now everyone had to go into the Capitol with me and try to convince lawmakers to vote yes or no on legislation based on merits, based on information. We had a huge achievement that was set back phenomenally by Citizens United that directly affects nonprofits. When Citizens United allowed corporate spending in elections, the people who run the corporate political expenditure budget are the K Street lobbyists. They're the ones who identify the lawmakers that are friends and enemies and how to spend that money. So suddenly we went from a fairly level playing field to the K Street lobbyists once again became kings, because they are the ones that will instruct the corporations to funnel their money through a nonprofit organization spent to support or oppose specific candidates, and they are the ones who go to those candidates and say, that was us.
All right.